That is a bananas approach.
I'm Pickle Rick!
This therapist sees a pickle who manufactured a skin suit of rat stuff.
It's the worst egregious offense,
You don't listen, do you?
but it's also the one that matters the least.
What is the value for the narrative, and what is the presentation for the therapist?
That's our time.
Welcome back, everybody, to Frame of Mind, where psychology and filmmaking meet at the intersection of storytelling. I'm Jordan. I'm a filmmaker.
My name's Curtis. I'm a therapist.
Curtis, you're a therapist.
Yes, I am.
You also watch movies.
I do.
Have you ever been interested in the way that therapists are portrayed in television, movies, film?
Honestly, fascinated. If you were just off the top of your head,
Yeah.
you were going to name the first three media therapists that come to mind. Who are they?
Robin Williams in Good Will Hunting.
Yep.
100%. I thought immediately Patrick Jane from The Mentalist, but he's not a therapist.
He is not a therapist.
He kind of feels like
he
one,
looks
though.
like a therapist. I'm curious about like what you, because there's a conversation that people have about this in my field, but I'm really curious from your perspective on the filmmaking side. What is your general take on how well or poorly filmmaking represents therapists in their media?
So it's kind of hard for me to say how accurately it does it because I'm not within the profession, but I would say that from my perspective, therapy always gets an extremified interpretation.
Yeah.
So the therapist is always horrible at their job, disengaged, just not really there, or they're like monk, like I'm going to be the tranquil, peaceful, calm in the storm in the midst of this thing, and I'm going to help you through your process. They're never really portrayed as a real person.
Mm-hmm.
But I will say that I think in the last 5 years, that's started to make a shift.
Yeah.
It's starting to gain this understanding. Like, I think people are starting to understand that therapists are real people, and that interpretation in media is starting to take hold, where there is, like, the therapist will have some flaws of their own, even if they're not a central member of the story. There's something that they're not quite getting. They're more of a well-rounded character.
It's funny because it does feel like the presentation is kind of caught up. I feel like even recently in the last 10 to 15 years, the predominant presentation of therapists, or maybe a little bit longer ago than that, but it feels like the predominant presentation of therapists for a lot longer than it should have been was like Freudian analyst, client on the couch, not facing each other, like what they were doing in 1930, 40.
Yeah.
And that kind of, that trope or that image like lived for a way longer period of time while psychology and therapy was evolving, while things were changing, while people were making shifts and new discoveries and implementing new tools. And
They were all German. They all had a beard, mustache, and goatee. They all had right hands. Tell me about your childhood. That's the only things that I care about. All of your problems come back to your childhood.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I was reading a Reddit post the other day when we were kind of prepping for today, and it was fascinating how many complaints people had.
Oh, about like
about the representation of therapists in media.
Really?
Oh yeah, just like so many stories of either therapists or other people who have been to therapy who are like, this is awful, this doesn't work, this isn't there. But it was interesting because when I was doing the research, I found, I think, a couple of examples of things that were like not bad. So it's a mixed bag. And there's a lot of questions that I have.
Right.
A lot of things that I'm curious about that I want to explore. It's weird because it feels like today I'm not really coming in with an actual grounded sense or understanding. Today feels a lot more like exploration and discovery.
Which is weird because this is the field that you're most comfortable with.
Yeah. But it's like, this is the field that I'm most comfortable with, but it's also looking at the way that it's presented in a way that often doesn't match.
I see.
And it's like, what's the caricature of a therapist? And I don't really know.
Yeah.
But I do have one question.
Yes.
And this isn't something that I think we can answer right away. I think it's going to be something that we kind of unpack over the entire episode because I don't know the answer yet, but I feel like the more we look at it and talk about it, the more we'll get to an answer.
Yeah.
So there is a lot of sentiment that therapists are presented poorly in media.
Yes.
What I'm wondering about is, why does that happen? And because we could sit here and say, yeah, this is a crappy way to present therapists. You should do it this way. Do better, filmmakers. But I don't actually like that idea because it doesn't feel like it actually gets at the meat of or the mechanics of So why did it happen in the first place?
Yeah.
It feels like a very untherapeutic response.
Yeah.
So what I want to look at is, what is the narrative role that therapists tend to play that then drives the story forward, that might be the reason that they're presented the way that they are?
Yeah.
Because they're serving a function, a purpose for the story, not to actually do therapy.
You know what is really cool about that? That actually ties in perfectly to my first example.
Beautiful.
I don't think you'll be expecting this one.
Let's see what you got.
Have you seen Rick and Morty?
I have. You're right. I was not expecting this.
Morty!
Rick?
Hey, Morty!
Rick?
Morty!
Rick? Where are you?
On my workbench, Morty. I turned myself into a pickle, Morty! Boom! Big reveal. I'm a pickle. What do you think about that? I turned myself into a pickle! I'm Pickle Rick!
Rick, did you do this on purpose to get out of family counseling? Morty!
It's okay, Beth. I understand Morty's suspicion. I've misled him before. Morty, turn me so we're making eye contact. Morty, I assure you, I would never find a way to get out of family therapy.
So that's the context here, is that what I find so great about this scene is that therapy is the obstacle that Rick is trying to avoid, that incites everything that's going to happen later on in this episode.
From what I understand of the show, fairly in line with Rick's character, be like, oh, talking about things that are like actually deep and meaningful and important, like, and relational to other people. Like, nah, forget that. I'm not interested in that. I don't want to, like, I'm so smart that I can do these crazy scientific things, but I don't actually want to address any issues or challenges that we might be facing relationally.
Oh, 100%. You know what's surprising about that, though, is that it's everybody's go-to example when it comes to therapy and media, but that's Good Will Hunting.
Yeah.
Somebody who's incredibly intelligent, but that intelligence, for some reason, maybe it's a trope, maybe it's an archetype, but the person who is so intelligent is also not able to look inward.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. There's like almost like an imbalance, or like I don't know what you would call it, like an extremified version on either end, where the more that you lean towards one side, the more the other side. And it's probably maybe related to the thinking versus feeling parallel.
Yeah.
Where the more that you lean towards the side of thinking, it's likely that you may have more difficulty or challenges on the feeling side of things.
Interesting.
And I would say...
Is that something that's like borne out in data, or is that just something we sort of perceive and feel and kind of just vibe with?
I think it's more of a sense. There might be some data out there, but I don't have any offhand. It's more of that sense of, I'll put it this way. The more one tends to lean on a strength, the more vulnerable they are on the opposite side of the weakness.
I see. That makes sense.
And it, when you talk about Will in Good Will Hunting, when you talk about Rick, it's this idea I can imagine of when we're further on this side of highly intelligent thinker, there's going to be a tendency for us to enjoy spending more time there, to rely there, but also kind of to see ourselves there. And we'll feel very competent and capable there. Like, look, I'm amazing. I turned myself into a pickle. Isn't this the craziest thing?
The common experience that most of us have had.
But when you get further to that other side, where you start to move towards feelings, let's go to therapy. Let's talk about how we're feeling. Let's talk about where there's challenges in this relationships. We need to lean more on this other space where we have very little experience or maybe very little developed skill. And that can be really vulnerable for people because they feel like they have to go away from a place where they feel capable and go to a place where they feel incapable. And that can be really scary.
I think it's also interesting that it's not just that you have to do something that you are maybe less developed in, maybe less skilled in, but you also have to intentionally cast aside the thing that you are skilled in, and that sort of makes you who you are.
Yeah.
You have to put your identity to the side a little bit.
Yeah. Or even, this is maybe a good conversation for us to have too at some point, like the confusion that people often have between role and identity.
Ooh.
Because I would say somebody who's highly intelligent or a scientist or, math genius or whatever, that is not your identity. That's a role that you can play. That's a place where you can find capacity and ability and all that stuff. But it's more like a resource or an access point for your identity, not your identity itself.
I see.
People confuse those things, and that's where we get that fear of like, I don't want to leave this. I don't want to let it go. I don't want to lose it. And so let's rig up this whole thing where I turn myself into a pickle and don't have to go to therapy.
It's almost interesting too how the comical lengths that he'll go to in order to avoid therapy. It's almost like I will exert a crazy amount of energy to avoid doing something difficult. Arguably less difficult.
Well, that's the perception piece, right?
Yeah,
because
exactly.
like on the surface level, it looks like going to therapy would be way less difficult. But one of the things that I always love to tell my clients about is if you see something that looks like stupid or it seems simple and you're struggling with it, or you have this really big emotion for something that seems so minor, it's like, it's not the fact that your emotions are off. It's that there's something that you're not seeing there that's really important.
Interesting.
So in this case, for Rick, I imagine actually turning himself into a pickle is easier than going to therapy. If it wasn't, he wouldn't do it.
It's a good point, actually.
It might take more effort, but there's a big difference between being effortful and being easy.
Right.
Because one is about it's comprehension, right? I understand this zone about how to do the science and how to change matter and all this stuff. I'm so lost when it comes to human relationships. And so there's this like idea of I'm not familiar here. I'm not comfortable here. I'm not safe here. I'm safe in my lab doing crazy stuff. I'm not safe when it comes to actually talking about what's going on inside.
Yeah. What's kind of fascinating too about that is that this is sort of an episode where it's a microcosm of the larger narrative within the entire series.
Yeah.
It's like I'm this person who can quite literally do anything. I can bend reality to my will. But the core thing that drives the story forwards and that we find interesting about these characters is their really toxic and poor relationships that are developing to kind of show them who they are under the surface.
Yeah.
Those moments that we get to see Rick in a vulnerable place where he doesn't really understand, and he does have a heart. He does want to have a good relationship with Beth, his daughter. He does want to have a good relationship with his grandkids, but it's really broken and messy, and it's really tough for them to have any moment of connection that's not through adventure or escaping danger or something that's facilitated by an action. It's really hard to get to that emotional place for these characters.
It's cool where there's like there's an element there of character growth, right?
Yeah.
Where Rick is you can almost imagine him as being kind of one-dimensional.
Yeah.
In that you think about those strength and weakness.
Sliders.
Yeah, the sliders is the way, but I'm thinking about spectrums.
Yeah.
Like a strength and weakness spectrum. And he has a tendency to be all on this side and then all on this side, right? Where it's like super intelligent, alcoholic, like this, that like there's huge strength, huge weaknesses, which can create a very one-dimensional but also kind of polarizing character.
Yes.
But then the more that they have these character moments where they're working towards developing themselves, encountering their vulnerabilities, it's almost like they start to bring things together to be a little bit more balanced, not so way one side, way the other side.
I am afraid that my kids will get expelled.
Good. Summer, you go.
I am mad that I can't huff enamel without people assuming it's because my family sucks. I hope to be seen one day as someone that just likes getting high.
Look at this family go. You guys are pros. What do you guys think about doing this once a week? You must be Rick. I've heard a lot about you today. Your family is crazy about you. Your daughter holds you in very high regard. You're a lucky fella.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I pause for a second?
Yeah.
I don't know if this is intentional or not, but when we talk about good and bad therapist presentation, I feel like at least the piece that I appreciate about this is that this therapist sees a pickle who has manufactured a skin suit of rat stuff, who walks into your office and doesn't bat an eye. He's like, oh, you must be Rick. Yeah, that makes sense. Come on in, sit down. Like essentially that's a very cool therapist where they're like, yeah, whatever. Welcome in. Like,
Yeah.
pickle, weird Rick, whatever. Yeah, we're going to come in. We're going to talk about stuff. So
I can imagine the number of pickles who have walked into your office is probably zero,
Yes.
but there's probably a real world equivalent to the way that somebody's presented
Yeah.
or sort of the way that they are when they walk in.
Yep, and there's limits and boundaries, and like this might be one for me in a real setting where I'd be like, nope, this isn't happening. We're not doing this. But contextually in this universe, it's like Yeah, that's a cool presentation. I like that. Good for her to not be rattled by what shows up in her office.
Not be rattled.
Yes.
Well done.
Rick, why did you lie to your daughter?
So I wouldn't have to come here.
Why didn't you want to come here?
Because I don't respect therapy. Because I'm a scientist. Because I invent, transform, create, and destroy for a living. And when I don't like something about the world, I change it. And I don't think going to a rented office in a strip mall to listen to some agent of averageness explain which words mean which feelings has ever helped anyone do anything.
Rick, the only connection between your unquestionable intelligence and the sickness destroying your family is that everyone in your family, you included, use intelligence to justify sickness. The only truly unapproachable concept for you is that it's your mind within your control. You chose to come here, you chose to talk, to belittle my vocation, just as you chose to become a pickle. You are the master of your universe, and yet you are dripping with rat blood and feces.
Interesting how when you're talking about like you use the exact word adventure.
Yes.
She picks up on it. Boom, that's exactly it. Adventure is this one modality that you use to navigate the world, but it's the only one that you use, and you can't venture into these other things because you're bored, right?
I have no doubt that you would be bored senseless by therapy, the same way I'm bored when I brush my teeth and wipe my ass. Because the thing about repairing, maintaining, and cleaning is, it's not an adventure. There's no way to do it so wrong you might die. It's just work. And the bottom line is, some people are okay going to work, and some people would rather die. Each of us gets to choose.
Like, even when we're talking about the presentation of therapists, there's something about, again, when we're talking about how art is, there's something really interesting about how, in this example, the therapist is presented, because I feel like I have mixed feelings.
Oh, about this one in particular.
Like, there's good and bad, but again, it's this debate that we're having between what is the value for the narrative and what is the presentation for the therapist, right? Or like the representation of therapy itself. So
maybe that's a good place to start. What do you like and dislike about the way that Rick and Morty portrayed this therapist?
So there was a piece where she was talking to Rick and she did this whole diatribe and explanation, totally like undoing the entire structure of his psyche and kind of just putting it to him on a platter.
Yeah.
And then she gives Beth her card because it's the first session.
That's our time. I'm going to give you guys my card and hope to hear from you again.
I would never disassemble somebody's psyche in a first session. Like, that is a bananas approach to try to take. And it's honestly, it's one of the things when clients come talk to me, it's a huge fear for them where it's like, I don't want somebody to analyze me and break me down because people aren't ready for that.
Yeah.
However, for the purposes of the narrative in this show, it's really cool to see the therapist contending with Rick on his level.
Yeah.
Like, they both essentially do a monologue where they're talking with these like big intelligent words, and it's one whole cohesive thought idea that is, it's intense, but we can follow it as the audience. But it's like, you see her meeting him at his level.
Yeah.
And that's a really cool therapeutic piece. That idea of meeting somebody where they're at is really important for every new client that you have in therapy. Everybody's different. So you have to learn to get into their world and figure out what makes them tick and who they are. Mostly so that you can engage with them in the space where they are right now, where they're comfortable, the way that they like to engage, so that you can actually get that connection with them. Like, her doing that actually is probably way more likely to build rapport with Rick and have him come back for a future session and work on things than if she was like, oh, it sounds so hard for you. Like, he wouldn't resonate with that. So it's this really interesting thing where on the one thing that she did has both pros and cons when it comes to presenting therapy. You would never do this. But for the purpose of the narrative, it does some very interesting things.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear that I would have never pulled out the idea that disassembling somebody's psyche is something that's dangerous and you'd want to avoid within the first session. Because I'm just caught up in the story of it. I'm like, what a great moment.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, but that's probably really bad
Yeah.
if it was in the real world.
Yeah.
What I find kind of cool is that all up until this point, and even moving forward past this, there's really nobody who, like you mentioned, could contend with Rick.
Yeah.
He really doesn't have an equal.
Yeah.
And it's really cool to see how the person who really puts him off balance is the person who is skilled in the exact area that he's not.
Exactly. Yeah, she's like the Rick inverse.
Yeah, 100%. I think another thing, if we're talking about how the therapist and their portrayal pushes the narrative forward, I think it is partly that piece that you're talking about where there's some breaches in what you would actually do in the real world based on the fact that it's interesting to see Rick's psyche disassembled and to see him really be put face to face with his biggest problem.
Yeah.
I think it's also an interesting piece to understand that she's doing that for him, but she's also doing that for us as the audience.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing, right? Exposition.
Yeah. In a weird, exposition can kind of get a bad rap because it's like, well, audience, this is what the character's thinking and feeling.
Yeah.
But done in a way like this, and you have somebody's facial expressions and he's taken aback. He doesn't know what to feel. He's kind of realizing that he's caught. Yeah. That allows us to focus in on that and the emotion of what Rick's feeling in that moment and really take in what she's saying. And it doesn't feel ham-fisted where she's like turning to the camera and being like, audience, this is what he's thinking and feeling. It's more like, this is an explanation, and therapy is a place where you can do that.
Well, that's exactly it, right? It makes me think that maybe this is the first like piece of the puzzle for that original question that we're asking about like what is the role of therapists that leads them to be presented in the way that they are. And I feel like it is this, that therapists can often serve the role of exposition for pieces of character development that we wouldn't otherwise see.
100%.
It's like having a therapist in your show can be a useful tool in making the implicit explicit.
It's organically integrated in a way that is understandable.
Yeah.
It's done in such a way where it's digestible to the audience and doesn't take you out of that moment.
Yeah.
And so having a therapist there in a context where a therapist would actually normally in real life say, this is what you're thinking and feeling, allows it to be done in a way that's digestible to the audience. It's not the particular term that you would use in this situation, but there's a term called diegesis in filmmaking and in
Why
media.
have I heard that before?
Diegetic means that it's something that within the world of the piece of media that you're talking about, the characters are able to sense it, experience it, like interact with it.
Right.
So if you hear like a car crash and all the characters go out like, what happened? That's a diegetic sound.
Okay.
If you have a narrator over top of everything saying like, well, one day Rick woke up and blah, blah, like, and he's not able to hear that, that's a non-diegetic sound.
Okay.
And so I think part of I don't know if this is the correct way to use these terms necessarily, but this feels like a way where you can have something that would normally be non-diegetic.
Yeah.
Like this feels like
yeah.
a narrator who was saying like, so Rick was feeling strange because he realized that he was so capable as a scientist, but he couldn't really relate to the people around him. And he realized that he had all these problems deep down inside. That feels like something that would be non-diegetic, but having a therapist there makes it diegetic.
Yeah.
And it makes it something that both Rick can hear and understand and relate to and resonate with in the moment, in the show.
Yeah.
But we're also doing that as well.
It's like the therapist is talking out of both sides of their mouth, one to Rick and one to us.
Yeah, exactly.
And we're both getting that sense and being able to grasp it.
100%.
I actually have an example of another one that kind of does the same thing.
Oh,
but
okay.
I'm really curious to get your take about the differences between the Rick and Morty example and this one.
Okay.
Because I think there might be a bit of a different flavor to it.
Yeah, let's take a look.
So the three of you plan to use this flaming sword to cut through the gates of heaven and go home.
That's the plan, yes.
Do you mean actual gates? Like big and pearly? Are we talking clouds, harps, old dudes in white robes?
And my dad is Morgan Freeman. Focus, Doctor. Now, come on, I need you to help me control my emotions.
Well, emotions can't be controlled, Lucifer.
What? Wasn't that your entire job?
My job is to help you understand your emotions. I can help you become aware of what it is you're feeling or trying to avoid feeling.
Right, you've got that look on your face when you're saying something insightful and waiting for me to figure it out.
I think you married her to hide something. Or from something.
Right, look, what I may or may not be hiding is beside the point, Doctor. Either way, I need the sword lit, so come on. Emotions, chop chop.
You clearly have a lot of walls up, Lucifer. Between yourself and your emotions, and now between yourself and me. If you're unwilling to bring those walls down, I can't help you.
What's your reaction?
So I immediately, now that we've talked about the Rick and Morty episode, I immediately catch on to the fact that what she's saying, if it was just written down in a script, is so on the nose.
Yeah.
It's
so that's the perfect, because the whole feeling I'm getting, and it'll continue on in this clip, but the sense that I got when I was watching this was that feels very on the nose.
Yeah, 100%. But in a weird way, inside my brain, it's like, that's a little much, but it still works within the context of, if she actually believed that, she would actually say something kind of like that. It's like, it feels like you've got a lot of walls up. That feels like a line that a therapist would say.
Well, this is the thing though, right? Is that, and maybe this is where we get into how therapists are being represented. Because like you described, that's part of where I don't know if we want to call it like culturally conditioned.
Yeah.
But when you say that's what it feels like a therapist would say, I would imagine that's kind of like a collection of all of my experiences of what a therapist is like, media and personal, kind of makes it seem like this would be the case. And when I watch that, there's so many pieces in this first part of dialogue that they have between each other where I'm like, none of that stuff I would necessarily say. Like the idea of even telling a client, you have lots of walls up, is a huge no-no in my opinion anyways. Because there's this idea of like, you're telling somebody something. You're just kind of, you're very on the nose with them about it. And just in the same way that I think on the nose here feels kind of like, that's not really comfortable. I don't really like that. I don't really like the show coming up and telling me, hey, here's what Lucifer is dealing with. He can't deal with his feelings. He needs his therapist to do this, and it's going to guide. Like, that feels, I don't know, there's something not quite right about it. And I think in the same way, when you tell somebody like, oh, you're anxious because your parents didn't love you when you were younger. It's like, we can kind of intuitively tell, even if you're right, that won't help the person. There's something about just laying it out for somebody where it misses the therapeutic part of therapy. And I think a lot of the time what we tend to do as therapists is we're much more in the realm of like leading clients to coming to these ideas, right? Like even the part where he's saying, you're giving me that look where you're saying something insightful and waiting for me to catch it. That is also a lot of people's idea of therapy.
Yeah.
Is like the therapist is going to be this really smart person, then like eventually we're going to catch on and figure it out. It's totally the opposite. I find a lot for myself as a therapist, I ask really stupid questions that get the person to become more insightful about themselves. And ironically, I think that follows actually the storytelling idea that we've talked about before of show, don't tell.
Yeah.
And like showing is way more impactful than telling. When I can, in the therapeutic realm, when I show somebody something, it's because I'm helping them tap into their own experience. And your experience is going to be a way better teacher than I could ever be.
Yeah.
Mostly because if your experience isn't connected to what I'm saying, then we're going to have an in one ear, out the other situation.
Right.
Like, oh, that's cool advice. Don't care. It doesn't matter because it hasn't impacted me. There isn't a place for it to land. I have to access your experience first so that there's a landing space for what you and I are talking about. Otherwise, we're not going to see that change showing up. So it's maybe one of my challenges with the way that it's presented is, they kind of lay all that stuff out very straightforward. And then, oh, the person has changed or they do something differently.
Yeah.
I think typically how it works.
It's interesting because it seems like you are way more upset with this portrayal than I am. And I think you're rightfully way more upset about this than I am. I think there's a couple of things that I latch onto, which is when he says, for example, you're giving me that look. That to me is, yeah, it is a little bit of like, whatever, but it feels in line with the genre of this.
Yeah.
Of this show. Like it feels like that's sort of like a quippy little remark that gives it a little bit of character and makes it what it is.
Yeah.
So I think there's an
like
interesting...
like this early evening, or like, I don't know.
Comedy drama.
Yeah.
It's like quippy. It's sort of like, it's a little upbeat. It's really dark in a fun way. It's like, I am Lucifer, but I'm also kind of funny.
Yeah.
It's that sort of push-pull of like really dark, really light at the same time.
Yeah.
But I think there's a concept in filmmaking that I think establishes what it is that you're getting at. And the idea is that a lot of times in filmmaking, you have to make something that is not the way that it would be in reality in order to make it more digestible.
Yeah.
A lot of the times, the way that you would mimic lighting or mimic the way that something sounds is not the way that it would be true to reality, but it's the way that makes everything feel the way. Like, nobody in the real world has perfect rim lighting around the back, silhouetting them and separating them from the background. That just doesn't happen. That's something we do in order to make the perception and the watching of a show, the watching of a movie more digestible, and it helps that person to stand out so that you focus on them.
Totally.
When you go into something like sound design, for example, a lot of times people will do some really creative sound design. Like, bones breaking is not the sound of bones breaking.
Yeah.
It's celery, it's all these different vegetables that you're like cracking because the sound feels more real than what the real thing would actually sound like.
I'm really glad to know that Foley artists aren't actually breaking human bones when we hear it in film.
Yeah, that would be a little bit concerning. You're just drawing the short straw every day. It's like in the
oh
office,
man,
like
you're the one who's got to go get the cadaver and snap the bones.
And the person whose bone being broken today is
oh no,
Jim from accounting.
I should have never interned here. This is a terrible idea.
This is the worst internship I've ever.
I love what you're talking about with this because it's making me think about another piece that this might be telling us about, which is kind of like there's an unrealness to the show, and I think one of the part of filmmaking, the tool that people use, or the thing that you have to pay attention to as a filmmaker, that's really standing out to me in this example of why the therapist might be portrayed this way and kind of like laying things right on the nose, is pacing.
Yeah.
Like, how long was this? 1 minute and 20 seconds.
Yeah.
They had to, for the pace of the show, because it's like happening over days for a single, I don't know, like 40 or 30 minute episode, whatever this is.
It could be 20 minutes if you include like commercial breaks and stuff. So.
But like, they have to condense everything that would have happened in an hour-long therapy session into 1 minute and 20 seconds. So of course you're going to have to be a little bit more on the nose. And I imagine that for everything, the In Treatment is a very different example because that was like a show where it's just one session. 99.9% of therapists presented in media will never have that much space to work with because other stuff has to happen. This isn't a show about therapy. This is therapy being a mode, or this is therapy being a plot device to get the story moving.
Exactly.
And so we're only going to be able to take the highlights of it, and you can't just, cut up a therapy session into those 5 minutes of 15-second highlights of people doing work while the rest of the interweaving stuff is kind of boring. It's like, no, you have to make it look like this was a minute-long conversation that really transformed what this person thought.
And it's interesting, too, when you think about, they probably shot a lot more than this.
Yeah.
And they had to cut out a little bit. So what else would they have included?
Yeah.
What else? It kind of goes back to what we talked about before of like, there might have been context that's missing that kind of made it feel a little bit different. But when you got to crunch everything down into a certain amount of time, it's like sometimes for the sake of the larger thing, which is the show being within the parameters and the time constraints that they have to make, sometimes those are really hard sacrifices to make, but you kind of got to make them. There's a term in filmmaking called killing your darlings, which is it's basically like you could have this amazing, like fantastic cinematic shot that you spent weeks preparing, and it's this amazing oneer that goes from like this angle to this angle. It's like, oh, and it's amazing, but it doesn't serve the story. You got to cut it out. Because at the end of the day, people aren't watching this in order to see like this amazing, beautiful shot. Or unfortunately, they're not watching this show to get a really good understanding of therapy. They're watching it for the underlying story. And this is a thing that serves that end. And it kind of sucks that the portrayal of the therapist misses a lot of the things that might give people a bad understanding of a therapist. But at the end of the day, it's like there's only so much you can do, unfortunately.
Your killing the darlings idea like really hits me because there's a piece of that makes me feel like, especially when you were saying that it's in service to the narrative. Yeah. And that really made me think about how TV and movie therapists are not in service to their clients. They're in service to the narrative.
And to the audience.
Yeah, which is, it made me think about my own experience as a therapist when I work with like insurance companies. where somebody else is paying me to work with a client. And normally if a client was coming in private pay, I don't have any concerns or issues because it's just, okay, you want to talk to me about this, you can spend however much money you want, you can do however many sessions you want, and we'll work on the things that you want to work on. And this is really straightforward. It's the easiest way. There's no consent challenges in terms of that. Like, it's way more straightforward, and usually it makes the whole way smoother experience. But whenever you get an insurance company involved, and it's like, now you got to talk to an insurance adjuster, now you got to talk to a case manager, now you got to like navigate through these relationships of other stakeholders who have other values.
And unfortunately, those values might have nothing to do with the ultimate well-being of the client.
Well, exactly, right? Like their goal might be get the client back to work, which is a helpful goal, but does the client have something else that's more important to them? Is there a different issue that's showing up as a result of something that's happened to them that they need to work on before they're going to be able to get back to work? But the people in the insurance company are saying, no, this is the priority, this is the goal, this is the only thing that I want to focus on, and we are paying for sessions. And then it becomes this like, well, how do I navigate the relationship between the payer and the client? And it seems like there's something very similar going on when we have therapists in media. They have multiple masters to serve. There's the client in the series, but then there's also the audience. There's also the story itself, even like advertisers, which create pacing challenges because there's only so much time that you can do things. And this story is being put on TV because it's here to sell some advertising for people. Or like part of what helps the show get onto TV is the fact that it can sell advertising. And so it's got to have this pace and it's got to have these spaces, and it becomes messy. And maybe that's where one of the challenges lies.
I'm really glad that you picked that. I would have never thought about the idea that you have in the real world as a therapist somebody that you're beholden to beyond the client, beyond the patient.
Yeah.
That's something that I wouldn't have picked up on. And it really makes a lot of sense because, there are so many things that you have to focus on, not just what's an accurate portrayal. I think what's also kind of latches onto that is the idea that what a therapist says has to be written in a way that's digestible to the audience.
Yeah.
So you may have particular phrases or things that are most effective in the therapy session with that person, but it might kind of go over the heads of most of the average viewer. So if there's something that is more accurate to how a therapist should be, how an accurate representation of a therapist would actually be in the real world, but it doesn't make sense to the average audience, which one is more important?
Well, that's interesting because then it comes back to this multiple masters thing that you have to serve. Maybe that's going to be one of the reasons that a presentation of a therapist, especially, and I want to say more of these, mass media is not the right word, but like
popular media.
Yeah, popular media versus more niche artistic media.
Your pop culture therapist.
Yeah, your pop culture therapist is probably going to have to be a lot more generalized.
Yeah.
So they're going to say very, like you said, what I would expect a therapist to say. In many ways, maybe that's an example of where Lucifer did what it was supposed to do, because it made you as an audience member think, that's the kind of thing a therapist would say. Okay, good. So we're meeting people's expectations of what a therapist would say. We have this character who feels like a therapist to our audience.
Yeah.
And that's what they're looking for. Again, it's like they're looking for audience immersion. If they're like, wow, that's a really weird version of a therapist, does that pull them out?
You know what I find kind of interesting and surprised me is that when you first brought up this Lucifer clip, I was surprised by the fact that you were upset about a portrayal rather than happy about the portrayal about you can't just fix somebody's emotions as a therapist.
Which is funny because I am happy about that.
Yeah, but that's not the thing that was like you were so irked by the fact that this thing they didn't do this properly. This isn't the way it doesn't feel. Yeah. But there's also really good things that they were doing.
Yeah, like the fun, and if we keep watching, actually, it'll go even further and show how the fundamentals of what she's talking about from a, I don't know if I want to call it like a theoretical orientation, from a philosophy or theory of psychology framework. The stuff she's saying is great. It's bang on. But how is it presented? And there's a difference between the content and the context.
Right.
It's like the content that she's presenting here, phenomenal. The context, I'm not a huge fan.
It turns out you were right, Doctor. It's impossible to control your feelings. And anyone who does risks turning into a murderous lunatic with a child of below average intelligence, so...
Yeah, well, I'm sure at least some of that's inaccurate. But I'm glad you've come around. Are you ready to be more forthcoming now?
Yes, I suppose. That's what it takes to get you to help me. So, I wasn't lying before, obviously. I do intend to use the flaming sword to cut through the gates of heaven.
But what you left out
Is that once I do that, I plan on kicking Mum into heaven and slamming the gates on her backside.
that she'll be trapped there on her own. Won't God destroy her?
Hopefully they tear each other apart, then they'll both get what they deserve.
What's that?
Punishment. For manipulating me. I mean, Dad set a trap for me, but Mum was the one who made sure that I fell into it. She was the one that made sure that I felt... that I felt things that I don't want to feel anymore.
That right there. That what you stopped yourself from feeling. That's exactly what you need to feel.
Well, the anger. Oh, I feel it.
Not the anger. The pain. That's what you've been suppressing. All the pain and heartbreak that you have over what happened with your mother. And Chloe. I know it's difficult. But the only way to get over that pain is to go through it.
And so I think that second half probably does a much better job of highlighting the accuracy of the content.
This is kind of blowing my mind a little bit because I'm more upset with the second half and you're more upset with the first half.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. It's just
very interesting.
So from a dialogue perspective, that feels more ham-fisted to me.
Yeah.
It feels more like you're holding the audience's hand through the process.
Yeah.
Rather than it felt to me like that was her speaking to me as an audience member more than it was her to speaking to Lucifer as a character within the show.
Which is funny because I thought that was a more accurate representation of what a therapist would actually do.
So maybe what I think is interesting is that if we're both pissed off at different parts of this, maybe they're walking the line pretty well in between what
like
they should
they're pissing off
actually
the therapist and the storyteller equally, so
Yeah.
they're probably finding a middle ground somewhere.
Maybe they're walking the line pretty well if we're both upset.
I wonder about how much, like, the parts that irritate you, maybe the parts where they're sacrificing story for the therapeutic piece, and the parts where they're irritating me are sacrificing therapy for the story elements.
I think that's exactly what's happening. There's two ways to look at this. I think one way would be that if you're making everybody upset, you're doing something right. Like if you're making
everything wrong.
Or
I
everything wrong.
I don't know.
Well, that's what I was going to go to, is that I think there's a way. I think there must be a way to do both at the same time. And I think the only thing that I'm left with is that it's possible, but it's incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
So the writing that it would take in order to formulate something that makes sense to the audience, that is accurate to how a therapist should actually interact with their client, is shot in such a way that it's paced well, that you can actually get all the context without cutting everything out, and have it all coherently mesh with the central theme of whatever the story is for that show or movie. Like, that's a big job.
So maybe what you're saying is writers might have a really tough job presenting therapists in their media.
Maybe there's a reason they went on strike.
Stop making us represent therapists in this way. We need more time and space.
If you want good shows, give us more money. I'm for it, 100%.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I never thought about that, though, that it is like, because you and I have talked about this earlier in episodes about the intangibility of the psychological pieces.
Yeah.
Like the difference between if you're going to work out and kind of lift weights, get stronger, get faster, get more healthy, whatever. Like, that's something very tangible you can do. There's something very intangible about the therapist piece.
Yeah.
And it makes me think about maybe why are there so many more shows about police officers, firefighters, and doctors than there are about therapists?
It's so much more accessible.
It's concrete.
But you also think about who is more typecast than the police officer. fat, overweight, uses their power in a corrupt way, loves donuts. It's like
That's true. There's lots of negative representations of that people in other industries too.
Negative stereotypes, negative archetypes, kind of these typecast examples of what it looks like because it is digestible.
Yeah.
And it's only when you have, say for example, it's only when you have cop shows that you really delve into like what's underneath. What is the life of a cop really like?
Versus having a cop in a show.
Exactly. Yeah. If you have a cop show, you can really delve into it. If you have a cop in a show, they're more of like this caricature.
So this might be totally on a different subject, but you said something that just kind of like hit me like a frying pan over the head. Mm-hmm. Are stereotypes more digestible?
I think that's exclusively why they're relied on so much. So when you think about it this way, if you don't really have the knowledge of what goes on in an industry, it's a lot of work for somebody to process everything that they're taking in because it's all new.
Yeah.
So if you have something that's recycled, it's like a keyboard shortcut, or it's like something that you've already like set up in advance. It's like, oh, like I know that, or it's like a little box that you have organized. So if you have this little knickknack, it's like, oh, I have a box to put that in. Yeah. I know exactly where that goes, and then you don't have to focus on like the energy of like this thing. Like, where does it go? Where do I put this? Your mind is all the space in your mind is being taken up by like this thing. Where do I put it? Where does it fit? As opposed to what is it doing to progress the story forward?
It's like it totally makes sense to me, and it feels like stereotypes are probably cognitively efficient.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it, actually.
It's like way less strain on the brain, way less fighting to have to figure out where to categorize. Like, oh, I have this very easy to recognize box. Here's this very easy to recognize piece that just goes in this box. My world is organized. Mm-hmm. I have things figured out. Mm-hmm. And I mean, there's tons of other kind of extrapolations we can make to the rest of the world about where people use stereotypes or where people jump to conclusions about things when in their relationships with anybody else in the world, strangers, friends, family, whatever. And like how much of that is driven by a need or even like an unrecognized tendency towards cognitive efficiency.
Oh, 100%. I think the reason specifically within a story context is like I have efficiently categorized this thing so that all of my mind space is pointed towards the thing that I need to figure out.
Limiting friction.
Yeah, exactly. You're taking away obstacles for the audience so that they can focus in on the thing that you really want them to focus on. Maybe they're piecing together a clue in a murder mystery. Maybe they've got a lot of stuff that they got to figure out, a lot of other moving pieces and parts. Yeah. And if they've got too much happening around the edges that doesn't really, which matters if you're thinking about how do you think about cops in the real world? How do you think about therapists in the real world? Those things matter. But if you're staying in the vacuum of that piece of media, just that show, that movie, it doesn't matter in that context.
So for our example, what we're talking about here, like a highly stereotyped therapist might be the most efficient way to get the character out of the way of the narrative.
Yeah.
So that they're, again, serving the narrative rather than being an impediment that the audience has to get over to stay with the narrative.
Exactly. And on that note, there's actually another example I have that maybe goes right into that.
Go for it.
I heard this song on the radio the other day. And the guy was singing that his name was Carnival.
Arthur, I have some bad news for you.
You don't listen, do you? You just ask the same questions every week. How's your job? Are you having any negative thoughts? All I have are negative thoughts.
So that one's an interesting one to me because that's maybe an accurate portrayal of what a bad therapist or social worker would look like. But from a narrative standpoint, it's really cool is the wrong word, but cool for me to see how in that scene, they're both using each other. So his accusation of her is that she doesn't care. She's not listening. Essentially, she's just doing this for a paycheck.
Yeah.
It's a job, whatever.
Yeah.
He's doing that because he's got problems and she's his access to medication.
Yes.
They've cut our funding. We're closing down our offices next week. The city's cut funding across the board. Social services is part of that. This is the last time we'll be meeting.
Okay.
They don't give a shit about people like you, Arthur. And they really don't give a shit about people like me either.
How am I supposed to get my medication now? Who do I talk to?
I'm sorry, brother.
So from a narrative standpoint, their connection, their interaction is purely transactional. And so when that relationship is severed, like now you have a conflict within the story that progresses it forward a little bit. Yeah. The idea here, this is the Joker. He's obviously like insane. But what happens when you have sort of this last piece of somebody's connection to reality being taken away from them? And that is a really important factor of like why he ends up going down the road as far as he does.
Yeah. It's like what happens when you pull the rug out from somebody who really needs your support, who's kind of on that breaking point.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's interesting because it's like it presents a negative portrayal of a clinician or a therapist or even the system, but it's also asking a very important question about what happens to people when their support is taken away.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's almost like a underneath the negative portrayal of the industry or the clinicians, there's a really valuable question being asked.
Exactly.
And it's like, does this make you uncomfortable? Does it feel bad? Good. Probably should. What do we do? How do we support people who really need it?
I think another piece too is that how as a filmmaker do you portray something in a way that even if you're doing it poorly, you don't present this as the way that everything is.
Yeah.
So what I like about this is that there's nuance. Arthur thinks that, hey, you don't care about me. And her response is, the people who are paying me don't care about you.
Yeah.
Like I'm also in a tough situation here too.
Yeah. Which again, not a response that I would give to anybody as a therapist.
No, exactly.
But for the narrative, it's this, to me, what that felt like when I was watching it was it stacks Arthur's character against the system.
Mm-hmm.
Like really the epitome of what the Joker does, especially in the film, is that it's like there isn't really a superhero for him to fight.
No.
It's his origin story really of him against the establishment in Gotham.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's like, here's how the system is set up. Here's how it doesn't take care of you. Here's how you're struggling and you don't get the support that you need from anybody. Everybody abandons you. Nobody cares about you. And it's now his fight against that, which is really epitomized by her saying, they don't give a shit about any of us.
I'm struck by how it was acclaimed by everybody. It's got great writing.
Yeah.
It's masterfully created. And it's also something that when I see a really bad portrayal of therapy, it's not something that I think about, this is the way it always is in the world.
That's exactly what I thought too.
It's really nuanced, and it takes this concept of exploring something without portraying it as the way that everything is, as a caricature of the way that the world is. It's exploring it as a thing that maybe we should look into more, that we should fight against. In instances, when I look at this, I see, when instances like this happen, I understand it a little bit more rather than the world is this way.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because when I watched the movie initially, this scene definitely didn't stand out to me as this is a presentation of how therapy and psychology is done in the real world.
Yeah.
Even though Joker is probably one of the most grounded in reality comic book superhero films that exists.
Mm-hmm.
Like it is the most grounded, it is the most realistic, yet I was not making any extrapolations about this therapeutic interaction to the real world. And I have no idea why that is.
I think there's something intangible about the way that it's not even about the way that it's written so much. It's the context around it. Everything just, I don't want to use the word vibe, but the vibe that you get is, it feels like it was carefully crafted. It feels like it was done in such a way that the focus is not on the interaction.
Yeah.
The focus is on everything that's happening underneath. I don't know necessarily how to put it any other way, but I'll try to put it this way. I think in the same way that the more that you try to explain a joke, the less funny it gets.
Yeah.
In the same way, it's really tough to say why an interaction or why a scene with a particular occupation doesn't feel like they're putting it forward as a representation.
Yeah.
It's really tough to explain why that is, but the more care and the more mastery that you put into that scene, the less that it seems to feel that way.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, this is not a scene that got shot for a weekly airing TV show. This is we took a lot of time. There's a lot of effort and a lot of resources going into a show that's not going to have its budget like really killed by editing or special effects. It's really a focus on the acting and the character interactions. And so you can imagine like the script writers, everybody who's involved in the production side is really going to be focusing and honing in on that. Like, I mean, especially given you cast Joaquin Phoenix as the lead, right? Yeah. If that's what you're doing, your focus is on character interactions and dialogue. That's what you want the audience to be paying attention to. So that's where you're going to dump all your resources. And, you know, since we're talking about great actors.
You don't know about real loss, because that only occurs when you love something more than you love yourself. I doubt you've ever dared to love anybody that much.
Good Will Hunting. You did it. You went to the classic example that everybody goes to with therapy and film.
Well, this is the reason that I did, right? Because when I asked you at the beginning, could you name like your top therapist? Like the only one that really stood out was Robin Williams' character, Sean Maguire, in Good Will Hunting.
Yeah.
And I feel like for many people, maybe of a older generation than us, I don't know what the alphas and Gen Zs are doing, but for most of us, I feel like this is the template of film therapist that most of us have for lots of different reasons. Like I'm even looking at, this was made in 1997. This was kind of right at the cusp of that golden age of cinema when it was getting towards 1999, like the best year in film and all that stuff. You have phenomenal actors in Robin Williams and Matt Damon. So, and then especially this entire movie in many ways is about the relationship between Robin Williams and Matt Damon, between the client and the therapist, without being super on the nose about it. There's lots of other pieces that are driving the narrative, but this is kind of a little bit pulled into the background thing that really holds it all together. So I was rewatching it, and I thought there were a couple things that struck me when I rewatched it for the context of our conversation here about presentations of therapists in media. Because there's lots of stuff that the therapist, Sean, does wrong. And yet I think he's one of my favorite presentations of a therapist.
Yeah.
Even though he's maybe not, technically speaking, and I mean technically like the therapeutic tools and stuff they would use may not be the best therapist that's been presented, but there's something about his portrayal of it.
Maybe it's the fact that he's a real human being.
Well, if we get into it, I think that's going to be probably something really important to pay attention to.
Look into my eyes. Get out, Will. I don't need therapy. That's enough. Get out.
So even just like Will being very similar to Rick actually in this way of like, again, the highly intelligent person who is like, I don't need therapy. I don't need to talk to somebody about this. And is kind of like dragging his therapist along. They take him to like 5 different people. And there's this testing out of therapists that I think normal clients will also do.
Yeah.
That you got to figure out somebody who fits. And especially for a client like Will, where there's going to be a very particular personality going on. Like you need to find someone who's going to connect.
I find it kind of interesting how it's portrayed in a really negative light, but this does sort of resonate with the idea that those therapists might have been portrayed negatively, but there's probably somebody who will actually be able to get something out of a whole bunch of different types of therapy. Like maybe hypnotherapy is probably like, maybe we won't get into the legitimacy or illegitimacy of it, but there are absolutely people who have found it helpful.
Absolutely.
So the fact that something is maybe not the best fit for Will or the best fit for you or me or somebody else doesn't necessarily mean that that's a bad therapist. It might just be a bad fit.
Which is what happens all the time. Like I'll have clients who come to me saying I didn't have a good fit with other therapists. They come and it works well with me. And I have clients that come to see me and then they don't show up again and presumably go to somebody else. And it's like, yeah, you have to find your fit. And it's weird how there's almost like that truth underlying the presentation where the surface level presentation here is look at all these people who can't do anything for Will. But underneath it, if we're engaging with this piece of media critically, we can see it's kind of reflected truly in the world of you might have to try out a couple of people to find the good fit for you.
Totally.
Right.
And on top of that, it also acts as another piece of really good contrast, because a failure to find a good fit in all these other therapists really highlights the perfect fit when he actually does get to Robin Williams.
Absolutely. There's a really interesting way that they choose to present the introduction of Robin Williams' character.
Trust. Very important in a relationship. It's also very important in a clinical situation. Why is trust the most important thing in making a breakthrough with a client?
I didn't catch this when I first watched this. His introduction also acts as a foreshadowing to how he's going to be interacting with Will.
Like, it's cool how, again, when we look back with the ability to analyze this, it is technically on the nose.
Oh, yeah, but it never felt that way.
When you watch it through as an audience member, not a critic or an analyst, you would never see it. But he says, trust is the most important thing in making a breakthrough. And then what happens for the rest of the movie? What is the entire goal for Sean in terms of interacting with Will? Can I build trust with this kid who doesn't trust anybody except for the closest people around him? But trusting these people means he can't expand his boundaries and, fulfill his potential. And so can I be this new figure who can create some trust with him to help him grow past his current limitations? It's beautifully put, and it's so simple and straightforward here. And I love how it's also camped in, like, again, terrible joke to make about sleeping with your clients as a therapist.
Yeah.
I mean, hey, if they don't trust you, you're never going to get them to sleep with you. That should be the goal of any good therapist. Nail them while they're vulnerable. That's my motto.
But there's a piece of it that kind of highlights, for me at least, why Sean is going to be able to connect with Will. Like, we go through the rest of where they first meet. Oh, you're both from Southie. You're both from the same neighborhood. You see how they interact together, and it's like very casual. It's all about rapport building, not fixing. And so Sean as a therapist is not like, I'm going to fix Will. It's, I'm going to build, and even not get him to trust me. I'm going to build trust with him. And he says it explicitly here. Trust is the key to unlocking breakthroughs in your clients. Trust is the thing that really, going forward, helps Will to make changes.
What a good example of exceptional writing, where the finesse that it takes in order to state something explicitly, so that if you read it on a page, you would say, this is really just telling me what to think or feel. But when you experience it through the course of watching the movie, it bypasses the logical part of your brain and just goes into your feelings, and you don't even perceive it. It's so masterfully done, because it literally tells you this is the story that's going to happen. But your brain doesn't pick up on that because it's so crafted into the experience of what's happening in the film. It's just a part of the scene.
Almost like, again, kind of an inverse of what we were watching with the Lucifer clip, where you were getting irritated about how ham-fisted it felt on the second half of that clip, because it felt so straightforward. And this does almost the reverse, where it's like, I'm going to tell you exactly what this movie is about and how it's going to end, but in a way where you don't realize that this is what the movie is about.
I think it's incredibly apparent why this movie won an Oscar.
I don't blame you. It's not about you, you mathematical dick. It's about the boy. He's a good kid, and I won't see you f*** him up like you're trying to f*** up me right now.
He won't be a failure, Sean.
But if you push him, Jerry, if you
Sean,
ride him...
I am what I am today because I was pushed and because I learned to push
He's
myself.
not you get that?
That sets the two of their ideologies completely at odds with each other. And so even in the way that we're paused here on this shot, they're both standing on opposite sides of Will, trying to get at him. Robin Williams' character is trying to pull him to one side, and then the mathematician is trying to pull him towards the other side. And the question is, who's going to win? What choice will Will make moving forward? It's really obvious in terms of the writing that you have competing interests for Will that are diametrically opposed. They're competing ideologies, but it goes in a way deeper too, because Robin Williams' character Sean is completely engrossed in the emotional side of Will. And how much more analytical could you get than a mathematician?
That's a great point.
So just in the way that the occupations of these characters are, it sets up this perfect opposition of ideologies where it's not stated, show don't tell.
Yeah.
The occupations that were chosen for the two sides that Will has to decide between are perfect analogies to what part of his psyche is he aligning more towards.
Yeah. Even when you're saying that about choice, there's something really cool about how part of what Robin Williams' character is doing here is the mathematician is looking at what Robin's character did as a failure. But what he's saying is, I made a conscious choice.
You think I'm a failure. I know who I am, and I'm proud of what I do. It was a conscious choice. I didn't f*** up.
Also, the pull that they're doing between Will's character, right? Or between Will and this scene. There's be who you could be and do all the things and get to the prestigiousness. But then there's also a cool conversation that Robin Williams has with Matt Damon later on is about, what do you want?
Look at me. What do you want to do? You got a bullshit answer for everybody. But I ask you a very simple question, and you can't give me a straight answer. Because you don't know.
Making a choice. And it's like, you could do all this stuff and fulfill this potential because you have this talent, but is that what you want? And should you do stuff just because you can? Or should you do things that feel like they align with you? And it's the whole, I would say, core conflict for Will when it comes to making this decision. And that's great, but there's also some issues with the way that Sean is portrayed. Lots of things about the portrayal here of like talking about what's going on with the client with somebody who's not a stakeholder who should be knowing about the stuff that's going on with the client, grabbing a client by the throat the first time that you meet them, right?
Yeah.
If you ever disrespect my wife again, I will end you.
Lots of things that violate like ethics. You're like, that's terrible, horrible therapist. But again, I think it goes to part of things we've talked about before, where we see the flaws in Robin's character, and that helps us connect with him more because he's a real person, even though those flaws are things that you would never want to show up in a therapeutic setting, right? It's like, as a therapist, we don't hide our flaws. It's more like, I'm going to put those things to the side for a minute, and I'm going to be doing as much as I possibly can to make sure that I'm caring for my own flaws, like not putting these away because I need to hide them, but like, these have a space to be in there okay here, but they're not the focus right now. It's on you.
And
right?
in a weird way too, the thing that you should be most concerned about in the portrayal of a therapist is the thing that you care least about. Grabbing a client by the throat, and like shoving them up against a wall, that should be alarm bells ringing. The worst thing that you could possibly show somebody in light of being a good therapist, that should immediately disqualify anybody from the realm of a good therapist in the collective conscious of the world.
Yeah.
But that's not the thing that matters most. And I think that it's interesting how the example of the best portrayal of a therapist that you and I both agree on in Sean in Good Will Hunting is also the person who doesn't perfectly portray who a therapist is.
Yeah.
In a weird way, you were complaining before in all those other examples about the inaccurate or improper ways that the therapist was acting.
Yeah.
And in this example, it's the worst egregious offense, but it's also the one that matters the least.
Yeah.
Because it serves the narrative and shows what a good therapist should be. Because underneath that egregious offense was truly the heart of somebody who really had the best interest of this kid and just had a moment of weakness.
Yeah. It's interesting because like I would never tell somebody do the stuff that Sean does in the movie. Because there's pieces where he like grabs his throat, he walks him to the pond and has that whole like monologue confrontation with him. And I would say like technically that's terrible. But there is something about when we look at building trust, right? Like, why is Will in therapy in the first place? It's because he got into a fight and he was going to be in jail. He's from Southie. Like, there's all these points where that's how Robin interacts with him the first time. He matches him with intelligence. He's been in the military before. Like, he's also pairing with him when it comes to the relationships that they have. Robin with his wife who's passed away, and then Will's character with the girl that he's dating. And there's almost this idea of when you're going to build trust, it's how do you make that connection with somebody? And part of, I think, the reason that the mathematician character brings Will to Sean in the first place is because, like, even though he says, you built rapport, I don't care, he also knows that's the only thing that's going to get Will engaged in the therapeutic process. And so it's really important for him to be able to do that. And then it's only once that trust has been built and that Will's, okay, I'm bought in and I'm here, that now Sean can start asking him, like, you have an answer for everything, but you can't tell me what you want. And I actually find that so much and this is where I love it, because so often in therapy, that's also the challenge that people are facing. It's like, you're looking at the context of your life and all these things that are going on, but what's your direction? What do you want to do? And is it possible that a huge portion of the reason why you're stuck is that you don't know what you want? And it's a big piece of, again, when we go back and talk about why would I as a therapist not want to tell people what they're feeling and tell them what's going on? It's like, because I don't know what you want. You know what you want. You are the one. And it's the idea of, like, the client is the expert of their own experience. The client needs to understand. The client needs to guide the therapy. The client needs to be the one who directs goals. Why is that? Because the client is the only one who has the keys to unlock the new direction, healing, which is, what do you need? What do you want? And it's never something that I'm going to, as a person externally, put onto them. It's not, and it's people's frustration. Like, go back to the Lucifer example. Like, you're supposed to help me. Give me the thing. Help me control my emotions. It's not something that I give you. It's something that I pull out of you. And I think that's maybe the most beautiful part of Sean in this movie, is that despite all his flaws and his challenges and the ethical violations and all the things you shouldn't do, essentially, fundamentally, he is portraying the essence of a therapist, which is getting onto somebody's level, building trust with them so that he can pull out what matters most for that person.
It's interesting hearing you say that, because what I'm hearing you say is that from a therapist perspective, you should not do what Sean does. Yeah. You should be who Sean is.
Exactly. I feel like maybe if I was going to rephrase it, how you said, like, this is who everybody looks at and says, that's the therapist I want.
Yeah.
And maybe then we can pull the ethical violations out and say, the core of what he's doing, yeah, that's what I want. Please don't grab me by the throat.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think when we're talking about why therapists are presented the way they are in media, and maybe with some unintended negative consequences that people see and complain about, there's lots of reasons for that, right? Like the fact that therapists are often a tool used by the narrative to make things more diegetic, more digestible, that they serve the narrative rather than their clients. There's pacing issues. There's lots of people who are trying to craft a creative narrative around a really complex and abstract profession. There's so many factors that go into it that I think make it almost impossible to write a good character at the same time as you write a good therapist. With Sean being maybe the closest that we've seen, which obviously comes with some challenges with it too, doing some things wrong. Maybe the place that we're left at is therapist presentations in media really should not be a standard or an influence on how therapists are perceived. I don't know how to deal with that, because I also feel like, how could they not be? Part of what media does is it sets culture. But I don't know. When we look at it from the filmmaker's perspective, I see it's so hard to write a good therapist in a story, especially if you're doing anything besides writing a movie that is about the therapist. So maybe it's how we set our expectations.
I think it's partly that. I also think that one of the reasons that we resonate so much with Sean is because maybe some of the surface level pieces aren't all there, but the soul is there.
Yeah.
And so when you have something where it serves the story and it has the soul of the thing that is true, even if technically things aren't accurate, if the soul of the thing is there, then that's enough for us to really understand what really matters under the surface for that particular character.
Yeah. And maybe it's maybe when you do that, when you can put the soul in, maybe that, it kind of goes back to the Joker idea, but when you put that in, maybe that's that missing ingredient where that's what'll help us bypass looking at the presentation of the therapist and saying, I should integrate that. I should see that as what really is. When the soul is present in the character, maybe that helps us see them as a character, not as a therapist. As somebody to connect with, not a stereotype to criticize.
As an example to reflect on, not something to emulate all of the little idiosyncrasies.
Yeah, exactly.
Guys, thanks so much for joining us for another episode of Frame of Mind. Hope that you enjoyed it. We hope that you kind of really got as much out of this as I think we did. I learned a lot that I really wasn't expecting to.
I actually really loved how we did this, where it was kind of explorative.
Yeah.
Because I didn't know or realize any of this beforehand. This was us watching stuff and then figuring it out.
Yeah.
And that was both really fun and I think really productive.
Yeah, I was surprised by how I thought I was going to pull out certain things, or I thought you were going to pull out certain things when I presented some scenes for you, but we went in a different direction.
Yeah.
I was also kind of happily surprised that we were upset about different things and had different priorities for what was important, and that helped us sort of figure out the middle of what was the most essential piece.
Contrasting but converging perspectives.
Yeah, exactly. What is the soul of what actually matters when we see these different occupations portrayed in media?
Yeah, I love it.
Please subscribe, please like the video, that really helps us out, and make sure to hit the bell icon so that you can actually get notified when we put out the next video. But for the next one, give us a suggestion about what concept, what topic, what IP, what story, what show, what movie would you like us to touch on?
Yeah, looking forward to seeing you all next time.